And now, a word from our sponsors. Hey kids, 9 out of 10 doctors recommend joining the Time Ghost Army.
Oh, it's wonderful, sir. It's wonderful, sir.
I'm Indy Neidell, and this is Out of the Foxholes, where I sit here, near my chair of infinite knowledge, and answer your questions about World War II. Now, I look at it longingly. However, today, it's only Sparty and I that are doing the whole shoot, and with relighting and resound and me having to fly back to Sweden in a few hours, I can only look longingly at it. But Chair, we're answering the questions anyway. All right, buddy? All right. That's what the chair sounds like. All the questions today are asked by members of the Time Ghost Army. The higher-ranking Army members actually get a guaranteed answer. If you want the same, join the Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Richard Long, a Time Ghost Army specialist, asked us in a live stream, any chance of an episode on the Irish who joined the British Armed Forces for World War II? It is our eternal shame, nice fly, it is our eternal shame how badly they got treated when they return. Okay. It's not a whole episode, but this question does work really well for Out of the Foxholes. So, Ireland has maintained a policy of neutrality in the war. Anglophobic public sentiment runs pretty strong among many Irish. Centuries of British rule and a hard-fought independence war in very recent history will do that. Irish Republicans are particularly angered by the fact that Britain still has a presence on the island in Northern Ireland. However, there is a long tradition of Irish recruitment into the British Armed Forces, which has survived independence and continues into the Second World War. 70,000 Irish soldiers will serve in the British Armed Forces over the course of the war. Another estimated 50,000 people from Northern Ireland will do the same. By comparison, Ireland's defense force consists of just over 100,000 soldiers. Nearly 5,000 of them will desert to fight the war for Britain. There are multiple explanations for why Irishmen join up with the British. They range from anti-fascist sentiment, lust for adventure, continued identification with the Empire, or just an income. Only a few are specifically critical of the neutral stance adopted by the Irish government, and all enlist voluntarily, as there are no official channels for doing so. There are a disproportionate number of Protestants among Britain's Irish soldiers, pointing to a strong unionist connection which still exists in that community even after independence. But Irishmen from all backgrounds have signed up. They serve scattered throughout regular British divisions, with little attention paid to their national origins. There were once many Irish units, but after independence, all Irish Line infantry regiments were disbanded, except for the 1st Royal Irish Fusiliers, the 6th Royal Inniskilling Fusiliers, and the 2nd London Irish Rifles. There are those in the British command that see the fighting spirit of Irishmen as greater when fighting under a common banner, and some even suggest joining Irish and Northern Irish soldiers in an Irish brigade. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill has always loved the idea of creating an all-Irish brigade or an Irish squadron in the Royal Air Force. In 1941, he writes a personal memo to the Secretary of State for War, Viscount Cranbourne. We have Free French and Vichy French, so why not Loyal Irish and Dublin Irish? But the political ramifications of such a move frightened Cranbourne and Northern Irish Prime Minister John Andrews. Plus, it has so far been possible for the Irish government to turn a blind eye to the thousands of Irish enlisting in the British Armed Forces. Creating a brigade that emphasizes all Irish participation and allegiance to Britain, well, that would make that kind of difficult. In the end, though, Churchill's wishes prevailed, although in a more moderate version. The 38th Irish Brigade is formed in January 1942. It is a merger of elements of the 3 remaining Irish regiments I just mentioned. The brigade's sense of Irish identity does show in various ways. Irish songbooks, its soldiers wearing the caubeen, a traditional Irish beret. By 1943, the 38th has distinguished itself in Operation Torch and the North African Campaign. But Churchill has agreed to this regiment not being used for propaganda purposes. about 2.4% of Ireland's nearly 3 million population will serve for the Allies, which is actually not that far off Canada's contribution of 2.8%. In the post-war years, Ireland will appear to not value the men who signed up. Deserters from the Irish Army that fought for Britain will lose their military pensions, and they'll have difficulty even finding employment. It will only be in 2013 that Ireland officially acknowledges that thousands of its sons served in the fight against the Axis powers. Time Ghost Army Private First Class Clemens Delalande asks, "Hello, Time Ghost team. I have a question for OOTF." That's this. Cool nickname, yeah? Yeah. I was wondering what happens with Chuikov during December, after the Sixth Army has been surrounded. We didn't have much news about him and the Russian army in Stalingrad since Operation Saturn and the encirclement of the Sixth Army. Okay, well, first things first. We're talking about a Soviet army here, not a Russian one. Ethnic Russians only make up somewhere between 54 to 58% of the Soviet population. So Russia and the Soviet Union are by no means synonymous. But as to the question, yes. As we all know, as commander of the 62nd Army, Vasily Chuikov led the defense of the city of Stalingrad. It was an incredibly tenacious defense, but once Operation Uranus, the broader counterattack in the region, began on November 19th, his role changed. The 62nd Army was then tasked with pinning down the enemy inside the city, slowly pushing them out and stopping them from preventing an encirclement. In other words, Chuikov and 62nd Army went from being the heroic defenders of the city to a small but important piece in Soviet offensive operations. So that is what Chuikov was doing throughout December, harassing German forces in Stalingrad. This was no easy task, especially because Soviet logistics struggled to keep up with the losses sustained in the earlier fighting. Although it did become relatively easier from the middle of December when the Volga fully froze over and supplies could be driven across. Still, munitions shortages meant Chuikov had to rely on artillery from the Volga's left bank, which was much easier to supply. He had his men map out the territory still held by the Wehrmacht. He set up a network of spotters and used landmarks visible from the other shore of the river to direct fire support. This ensured that the German forces had little to no respite from Soviet bombardment. The 62nd Army continued to take the city back, building by building. The fiercer the fighting was in the city, the fewer men could be diverted to the flanks, and the harder it was to prevent encirclement, precisely what Stavka wanted. On January 28, 1943, Chuikov was awarded the Order of Suvorov First Class for outstanding military leadership at Stalingrad. As for 62nd Army, Stalingrad earned it the recognition of being an elite unit, so it has been reorganized as the 8th Guards Army. Under this new designation, it has fought in the Izium-Barvenkovo offensive in July and in the Donbass in August. Time Ghost Army Captain Cesar Cruz asks, what was Mexico's role during the war? What was happening in January 1942 during the Conference of Foreign Ministers held in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil? Well, Mexico officially declares war on Germany, Japan, and Italy May 22nd, 1942. The declaration comes after German U-boats sink 2 Mexican oil tankers in the Gulf of Mexico. However, Mexico was not strictly neutral before this. Mexican-American relations are, well, they're complicated at this time to say the least. Many Mexicans here in the 30s and 40s have a distrust of the Yankee imperialists, to whom they lost over half their territory after the Mexican-American War. More recently, the Pancho Villa expedition in 1916 and 17 saw American forces invade Mexican territory, although this was in fact in retaliation for a raid on American territory. There's also the American occupation of Veracruz in 1914, which you can look up yourselves, but that produced a lot of anti-U.S. sentiment, and a lot of people were suspicious of Mexican intentions after the Zimmermann telegram in 1917, which was a German proposal for a military alliance with Mexico against the U.S., though that was rejected by Mexico. Still, Mexican politicians realize that an indifferent U.S. is better than a hostile U.S. To that end, German submarines have not been allowed in Mexican ports during the war, and private Mexican industry favors American investment. Which brings us to the third meeting of consultation of Latin American Ministers of Foreign Affairs in January 1942, also called the Rio Conference because it takes place in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. It has been scheduled for quite some time, but the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor gives it a new urgency, especially because the U.S. calls for an emergency consultation of foreign ministers throughout the Americas. Those that have already declared war on the Axis are Canada, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Cuba, Panama, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, and the United States. But some American nations aren't completely sold on supporting the Allies. Ezequiel Padilla Penaloza, a member of Mexico's delegation to the conference, however, has the view that the attack on the U.S. is an attack upon all American countries. Delegates bicker and debate for 2 weeks, but eventually, Mexico and the Allies are triumphant. After the conference, Brazil, Ecuador, Peru, Paraguay, and Uruguay sever diplomatic relations with Axis nations, and Mexico declares war shortly after. So, right now we're in summer 1943, meaning Mexico has been at war for over a year. But the Mexican military hasn't actually seen action yet. It's too small for combat, and finding recruits is difficult because most fighting-age men are working physically intensive jobs with cash crops or industry. Many of them are also in the U.S. thanks to the Braquero program, the diplomatic accords that allow Mexicans to work legally in the U.S. on short-term labor contracts. And Mexico's Navy and Air Force are outdated, and they're only used to defend Mexican shores. It will take several years of hard work for Mexico to have a fighting force worthy of sending overseas. And spoiler, only the Mexican Air Force will be ready for action by 1945. Attached to the American 58 Fighter Group, the 201st Air Fighter Squadron will see action in the Philippines, with operations ranging from bombing missions to providing support for U.S. airmen. But all this is not to say Mexicans, or at least those of Mexican heritage, will not fight and die in this war. Estimates are that roughly 350,000 Mexican Americans will serve in the United States forces in the war. The exact number is difficult to calculate, as Latinos are not segregated into their own units. One notable soldier is Private Joseph Pantillon Martinez, the first Medal of Honor recipient for heroism on American soil since the American Indian Wars. An automatic rifleman, his unit was tasked with driving the Japanese from a defensive line in the mountains of Attu Island. He was killed on May 26, 1943, at the age of 23, after forcing the Japanese from numerous foxholes, and still maintaining his assault even while wounded. His bravery saved countless American lives. So that ends today's Out of the Foxholes. If you have a question you'd like answered, you can ask it at community.timeghost.tv. But if you'd like it to be prioritized, then of course you can join the Time Ghost Army at patreon.com or timeghost.tv. Do not ask it here in the comments. It will not be added to the list of questions if you do. Again, go to community.timeghost.tv. You know, I still know there's going to be like 30 questions asked in the comments, in spite of that. I know there's going to be. You're doing it on purpose. Hey, if you want to see the extra weekly episode we did when the fight for Stalingrad began, you can click right here for that, right? See you next time.